Alright, settle in, get comfortable, let your eyes soften. This is one long, drifting sleep story, no chapters. No breaks, just a slow river of medieval moments, whispered coincidences, and strange alignments that history recorded but never quite explained. The night bells of a medieval city were never rung all at once. One bell would begin, then another far away would answer, and then another, until the sound stitched the darkness together. People believed bells kept evil away, but sometimes they did something stranger. They marked moments when the world seemed to fold in on itself. In the Middle Ages, time moved slowly. News traveled on horseback, letters took weeks. People were born, lived, and died without ever leaving their valley. And yet, despite all that distance, coincidences happened so precise that even monks, who wrote everything down, paused and added words like mirum, marvelous, or inexplicable and explainable. One winter night in 1187, in two different monasteries hundreds of miles apart, two scribes dipped their quills at the exact same moment. Neither knew the other existed. One was in England, the other in northern Italy. Each was copying a chronicle. Each reached the same sentence describing a long-dead Roman emperor, and each accidentally spilled ink across the page in the shape of a crooked cross. Both scribes stopped, stared, and wrote in the margin that they felt a sudden chill, though the fires were warm. Centuries later, when historians compared the manuscripts, they noticed the identical ink stains, the identical sentence interrupted, the identical marginal note. No explanation has ever satisfied anyone. Medieval history is full of these quiet echoes. There was a knight in France who survived a battle by slipping on mud, just as an arrow flew where his heart had been a breath before. On the same day in a village he had never visited, a child was born who would later become the monk who recorded that very battle, and he would draw a tiny illustration of a man falling. In mud, though, no one had ever told him that detail. When asked why he drew it that way, the monk said simply that he had always seen it, like that in his mind. In 1099, as crusaders marched toward Jerusalem, a strange rumor spread through the camps. Soldiers claimed they dreamed the same dream on the same night, a city wall glowing faintly blue, and a voice telling them to wait. That same night, inside Jerusalem, a Jewish scholar wrote in his diary that he dreamed of foreign soldiers outside the walls, frozen in place, unable to move until dawn. Neither side knew the other had written these things until centuries later, when the diary and the Crusader accounts were compared. The pause in the march, unexplained by weather or strategy, happened exactly that night. Some coincidences felt gentler, almost tender. In medieval Spain, there lived a woman who embroidered altar cloths. She stitched the same pattern again and again, a vine that looped strangely, turning back on itself. She said it comforted her, though she did not know why. Across the sea in North Africa, a man carved wood for mosque doors, carving the same looping vine pattern without ever having seen her work. When Christian and Muslim envoys exchanged gifts decades later, the cloth and the door panel ended up in the same palace. Side by side, the patterns matched perfectly, down to a tiny mistake where the vine crossed itself too early. Scholars still argue whether this is coincidence, shared symbolism, or something stranger. Then there were the deaths. King William II of England was killed by an arrow in the forest in 1100. Everyone argued about whether it was an accident or murder. What unsettled people was this? Decades earlier, his father had dreamed of a flaming arrow striking a tree and falling to the ground. That dream was recorded by a monk who had no reason to invent it. The tree William died beneath was later identified as the same type described in the dream. Medieval people believed dreams were messages, but even modern historians admit the timing and detail are unsettling. In Germany, during the Black Death, entire villages vanished. Yet in one town, records show that everyone named Johann survived, while others died in terrifying numbers. No pattern of age, wealth, or location explains it. Some thought it was divine protection. Others suspected coincidence. But even today, epidemiologists admit the data refuses to make sense. Coins themselves carried coincidences. A medieval coin minted in Sicily bore a tiny flaw star stamped slightly off-center. That same flawed stamp appears on coins found later in France, England, and even Scandinavia, long after the mint was supposedly destroyed. No record explains how the same damaged die traveled so far or was used for so long. The coin became a symbol among traders, whispered about as the wandering star. In a quiet abbey in Ireland, a monk once copied a gospel and accidentally repeated an entire line twice. Ashamed, he tried to scrape it away but failed. Years later, another monk in a different abbey, copying from a different source, made the exact same mistake on the exact same line. When the books were compared, people believed angels must have guided the hands, or perhaps something subtler was at work. A ripple passing through time. Sometimes coincidence arrived like a knock on the door. A messenger arrived in Constantinople in 1204 carrying news of a betrayal. At the exact hour he arrived, a statue in the city cracked down the middle. People panicked, believing it an omen. But what no one expected was that a traveler in Venice wrote of a statue cracking at the same moment, thousands of miles away, without earthquake or storm. 2 cities, 2 statues. 1 hour, medieval people lived surrounded by symbols and coincidences fed that world. But even stripped of belief, the patterns remain. A plague doctor in Florence kept a list of patients. On 3 separate occasions he wrote a name, then crossed it out, only to have the person walk in alive moments later. The crossed-out names appeared darker on the page, as if the ink had been pressed harder. Modern tests show no difference in ink composition, yet the pressure marks are undeniable. In a castle in Bohemia, a noblewoman gave birth during a lunar eclipse. At the same time, far away in Scotland, another noblewoman gave birth during the same eclipse. Both children grew to become rulers known for unusual mercy. Both died on the same calendar day, years apart. Medieval astrologers obsessed over this pairing, calling them the twin shadows. There is a medieval map that shows a coastline no European should have known. For years, scholars argued it was imaginary. Then explorers later found the coastline almost exactly as drawn. The mapmaker left no explanation, only a note that said, "I have never been there, but I have seen it." Perhaps the most unsettling coincidences are the quiet ones. A bell in a French village rang without anyone pulling the rope. On the same day, the village priest died while traveling miles away. When his body was returned, his hand was found gripping a piece of rope. No one could explain where it came from. In a monastery in the Alps, 2 monks wrote letters on the same night, each believing the other was dying. Both letters crossed on the road. Both monks lived many more years. And always, medieval writers added their small comments in the margins. Strange, worthy of note, God knows why. As the centuries rolled on, these coincidences stacked like stones. Not enough to build a clear structure. Too many to ignore. And maybe that is why medieval history feels so dreamlike. Not because people believed in magic, but because they noticed patterns we now rush past. They wrote them down. They preserved the moments when the world seemed to blink. So as you rest now, let those bells fade. Let the ink dry. Let the roads stretch between monasteries, castles, markets, and quiet rooms where someone paused, feeling that something had just aligned, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be remembered. History isn't just about big events, about kings and queens and battles. It's also found in the quiet whispers, the strange alignments, the little echoes that ripple through time. The bells did not just stop ringing when the ink dried on a declaration. Their vibrations lingered, and the coincidences gathered like dust motes in candlelight small, drifting and impossible to fully grasp. Think about it. In late medieval Prague, a clockmaker built a masterpiece. It didn't just tell time. It showed feast days, lunar phases, and even future eclipses. One night he noticed the clock predicted a rare alignment of stars decades away, long after he would be gone. He wrote the date in his journal, a simple act of curiosity. Years later, on that very day, a fire raged through Prague. It turned buildings to ash, but as it neared the square where the clock stood, the flames curved away, sparing it completely. Witnesses said that as the fire died, the clock's bells began ringing all on their own. Now, let's travel to a windswept English village. 2 children were born just minutes apart during a fierce thunderstorm to mothers who had never met. Both boys grew up to become scribes. They traveled to different monasteries, and incredibly both ended up copying the exact same obscure Roman poem. Even more strangely, they both made the same correction to a line that had stumped scholars for centuries. When historians later compared the manuscripts, they found not only the identical correction, but the exact same hesitation mark before it, as if both hands had paused, guided by the very same thought. It happened in construction too. A mason carving high in a cathedral tower in France etched a small personal symbol into a stone, hidden from view. Years later, in a completely different city, another mason carved the exact same symbol, insisting he'd never seen it before. When restorations revealed both marks centuries later, They were found to be at the exact same height from the ground, even though the cathedrals were different sizes. And their names? Guild records showed they shared the same birthday. There was the queen who feared mirrors. She claimed they showed her things that hadn't happened yet. One night, she saw her own reflection dressed in mourning clothes and, in a fit of terror, shattered the glass. The very next day, news arrived. Her brother had been killed in a hunting accident, under circumstances eerily similar to the scene she'd described. Her court dismissed it as a grief-stricken fantasy. But then, at that same hour, a mirror in a different castle cracked all on its own. Even money held its own secrets. One particular gold coin, minted during a terrible famine, seemed to appear at moments of sudden relief. A baker received it the same day a new shipment of grain arrived. A soldier carried it into battle and returned without a scratch. A widow sold it and found a job that same afternoon. When the coin was finally lost in a river, the floods that had been plaguing the area downstream suddenly stopped. People whispered that the coin had simply finished its journey. In monasteries across Europe, monks noticed something peculiar. On certain nights, candles in abbeys hundreds of miles apart would burn down at the exact same pace, their dripping wax forming identical shapes. These nights often coincided with the death of a great scholar or a king. There was no weather pattern or draft that could explain it. Eventually, the monks stopped questioning it and simply began to record when it happened. Imagine a city under siege in Italy. The defenders had run out of arrows. Just as despair began to set in, a cart overturned in the city square, spilling a load of iron rods perfect for sharpening into makeshift weapons. At that exact moment, far away in a village where many of those soldiers came from, a blacksmith dreamt of iron falling like rain. He woke before dawn and, without knowing why, began forging. A medieval mapmaker once drew a river on his chart that didn't exist. It was just a line on parchment. Yet centuries later, engineers planning a new waterway ended up redirecting a river along that exact path. The old map had faded, but the line remained, stubborn and strangely accurate. And the patterns kept appearing. Names that repeated through generations. Children named after saints who were born on that saint's feast day. Horses that stumbled in the same spot on a road, year after year. Storms that returned on the anniversaries of long-forgotten promises. None of these things were big enough to rewrite history. It splashed ink across his page, forming the shape of a broken circle. Beneath it, he wrote a single line. Something has ended. The timing of his entry matched the city's fall almost to the minute. And then the medieval world gave way to a new age. But these strange connections don't belong to just one era. They were simply more visible back then, in a time when silence was more common, when people listened more closely, and when these quiet patterns had room to breathe. History doesn't always shout its mysteries. It murmurs them, waiting for someone to notice. Even now, as you listen to this, somewhere in the world, two moments might be unfolding at once, connected by nothing we can see or name, yet moving together all the same. The world is full of echoes if we just take a moment to listen. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the strange corners of history, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The murmuring did not end with the fall of cities or the turning of ages. It simply grew softer, like footsteps retreating down a long stone corridor, still audible if you leaned close enough to listen. In the final centuries people now call medieval, there lived a humble miller beside a river in what is now Austria. He kept no diary, but parish records note something curious. Every time the river flooded, his mill survived untouched, while others were destroyed. After his death, the flood stopped altogether, as if the river had only been waiting for him to leave. Years later, when the mill was dismantled, workers found stones beneath it, arranged in a pattern no one remembered placing there, a pattern identical to one carved into a church floor miles away, laid by a different group of men a generation earlier. In England, a monk tasked with ringing the night bell overslept for the first time in his life. The bell remained silent. That same night, a prisoner escaped from a distant dungeon whose schedule was timed to the bells. No connection was ever found, yet the monk spent the rest of his days awake before the rope, terrified of silence. A medieval physician once noted that 3 patients with no relation, living in different towns, recovered from deadly illness on the same morning, at the same hour. Each claimed they dreamed of walking through a door that opened inward instead of outward. The physician underlined the sentence twice and never mentioned it again. There was a cathedral window shattered by a storm, its glass raining down like colored tears. On that same day, a glassmaker in another city abandoned his trade after dreaming his hands were bleeding light. When the window was restored years later, the new glass matched the old so perfectly that restorers could not tell which pieces were original. The glassmaker's son had made it, never knowing the story. During a famine, 3 letters arrived at a bishop's door on the same day. Each from a different region, each offering aid they could scarcely afford. The bishop noticed all 3 were sealed with wax stamped slightly crooked, as if the seal had slipped at the same angle. He ordered the letters preserved. Centuries later, the wax impressions were compared and found to be nearly identical, despite being made from different seals. In a small village, a bell cracked and could no longer ring. The villagers mourned it like a death. That same year, a child born deaf learned to speak clearly without instruction. The priest wrote that one silence became another voice. A medieval astronomer charted the stars faithfully for decades. One night, he recorded a star that should not have been there. Ashamed, he marked it faintly. Centuries later, astronomers discovered a supernova whose light would have reached Earth on that exact night. The faint mark remained, stubborn proof that someone had seen what should have been invisible. In a convent, 2 nuns kept separate gardens divided by a wall. Each planted herbs by instinct rather than plan. When the wall fell during repairs, the gardens were revealed to mirror each other exactly, every plant, every path, even the empty spaces. Neither woman could explain how it happened. A sword buried with a knight was later unearthed during construction. The blade bore a nick from battle. In a museum centuries later, a second sword from another country showed the same nick shape, angle, and depth. Metallurgists found no reason they should match. The battles had occurred years apart. As medieval nights deepened, people told these stories by firelight, not to frighten but to soothe. Coincidences reminded them that life was not entirely random, nor entirely controlled. Something moved quietly beneath it all. So now, as your breathing slows, imagine those old roads again. Imagine carts creaking, quills scratching, bells waiting for the right moment to ring. Imagine 2 events touching across distance and time, like hands brushing in the dark. Nothing needs explaining tonight. History has already done its whispering. And sleep, like the medieval night, gathers everything gently and lets it rest. The night keeps going, and so do the small, patient mysteries. In a quiet valley where fog settled like wool over the fields, a medieval shepherd counted his sheep every evening by carving a notch into a stick. One winter, he noticed something odd. The number of notches always matched the number of stars he could see through the mist. On clear nights, both were many. On fog-thick nights, both were few. Years later, after his death, his stick was found in the river, water-worn but intact. Astronomers studying old weather patterns realized the notch counts matched periods of unusual atmospheric clarity, something no shepherd should have known, yet his hands had recorded it faithfully. In a coastal town, a bell tower leaned slightly toward the sea. Sailors swore that when the bell rang at dawn, the tide shifted just enough to ease their ships into harbor. On mornings when the bell rope broke or the ringer fell ill, ships scraped the rocks. No engineer could prove the bell affected the water, yet the pattern repeated often enough that captains timed their arrivals by its sound. A medieval midwife wrote down the names of every child she helped into the world. Near the end of her life, she realized something strange. Children born on days of heavy rain often grew into travelers, while those born on dry, silent nights rarely left home. She underlined the observation but added a note: this may mean nothing. Even so, generations later, census records quietly agreed with her. In a scriptorium lit by narrow windows, a monk copied a prayer and accidentally reversed 2 words. Annoyed, he corrected it. That same day, a priest in another region preached a sermon and accidentally reversed the same 2 words aloud. Both men paused, felt unsettled, and corrected themselves at the same moment. The congregation never noticed. The manuscripts, however, preserved the hesitation. During a long siege, a city ran out of salt. Food spoiled, spirits fell. On the night despair peaked, snow fell unexpectedly light, clean, and plentiful. Citizens collected it, melted it, and used the residue to preserve what little food remained. Far away, a traveler recorded dreaming of white grains falling into empty hands. He woke hungry but hopeful, not knowing why. A medieval queen owned a ring passed down through generations. Every time it changed hands, a treaty was signed within the year. When the ring was lost during a journey, no treaties were made for a decade, and wars dragged on unresolved. When the ring resurfaced, found by a child playing in a stream, peace followed quietly, without ceremony. In a monastery perched on a cliff, two bells were rung from opposite sides of the building. Monks noticed that when rung separately, their tones clashed. But when rung together, even slightly out of time, they produced a single calm note that carried far into the valley. Travelers said it made them feel less alone. No one could explain why two imperfect sounds made something whole. A medieval bookbinder stitched pages together in the wrong order and didn't realize until years later. By then, the book had been read widely. Readers remarked that the strange order made the text feel prophetic, as if it knew what was coming before it happened. When the error was discovered, no one wanted it corrected. There was a bridge where horses always slowed, even when urged forward. On the day the bridge finally collapsed, no one was crossing it. A child had dropped a wooden toy into the river moments before, stopping the last traveler from stepping onto the stones. In a town square, a public clock stopped for exactly 1 hour. During that hour, no deaths were recorded in the parish. The next hour, 3 were. The clockmaker insisted nothing unusual had happened inside the mechanism. Still, people whispered that time itself had paused to catch its breath. A medieval astronomer and a village storyteller both described the same comet using the same unusual phrase, a scar in the sky. They lived days apart by horse, never met, and wrote in different languages. Yet the phrase, once translated, matched perfectly. As the fire burns lower and the night deepens, these stories don't ask to be solved. They simply exist like soft footprints in snow that hasn't yet melted. Let your thoughts drift among them. Let the bells fade into distance. Let the roads stretch endlessly, connecting moments that were never meant to meet and yet somehow did. The medieval world sleeps now. And so can you. The night is wide enough for many more footsteps, and the old world is patient. It keeps offering its coincidences slowly, the way sleep comes never all at once, never asking to be understood. In a monastery near the edge of a forest, a monk tended bees. He marked their movements on scraps of parchment, noting when they swarmed, when they rested, when they vanished into the trees. Over years, he noticed something peculiar. Whenever the bees disappeared for more than a day, a death occurred in the nearby village. Not always an important death, not always expected, but always within a short span. After the monk died, the bees left entirely, and the village grew quiet, aging gently, as though something unseen had moved on. A medieval stonemason carved faces into a cathedral wall, small ones, barely noticeable. He said they were people he passed on the road. Centuries later, restorers realized the faces resembled individuals whose names appeared in the town records around the time of the carving. One face, however, matched someone born decades later. The mason had never lived to meet that person, yet the likeness was unmistakable. In a snowbound village, a bell cracked during a funeral. On the same day, in a town far south where no snow fell, a bell cracked during the wedding. Both bells were cast by the same foundry, years apart, using the same flawed mold. No one had known the flaw existed until both bells failed on that single day. A medieval herbalist gathered plants by instinct rather than calendar. She said some mornings the earth felt ready, and other days it felt closed. When her notes were studied centuries later, the days she harvested matched perfectly with modern data on peak medicinal potency in plants' knowledge. She could not have measured, only felt. There was a river crossing where travelers often stopped without knowing why. Horses slowed, carts creaked to a halt. People rested there longer than planned. Much later, records showed that on days when travelers lingered, storms struck the road ahead within hours. The pause, unexplained, saved lives again and again. In a convent school, 2 girls copied the same psalm. Both made the same spelling error in the same word. When corrected, both rewrote it differently, but again in exactly the same incorrect way. Their teachers scolded them gently, unaware that the error preserved an older pronunciation long since lost. A medieval lord owned a tapestry showing a hunt frozen in motion. Whenever he considered going to war, he said the dogs in the tapestry seemed restless, their woven legs almost moving. When he ignored the feeling and rode out, he was injured. When he stayed, peace followed. After his death, the tapestry was sold, and its new owner felt nothing at all. During a harsh winter, 3 strangers arrived at a village on the same night. Each from a different direction, each asking for shelter. Each carried a loaf of bread, each offered it without being asked. The village survived the winter with no deaths. None of the strangers were ever seen again. In a medieval city plagued by fires, one narrow street never burned. Records show that a child had once dropped a candle there and cried so loudly that people rushed in with water, soaking the ground thoroughly. From that day on, flames stopped at the street's edge as if remembering. A knight lost his sword in battle and mourned it deeply. Years later, while traveling through another country, he saw the same sword hanging in a chapel as an offering. The priest said it had been found in a river the day the knight had nearly drowned elsewhere. The dates matched too closely to dismiss. In a scriptorium, a monk wrote a list of kings. He left a blank space where a name should have been uncertain. That king died unexpectedly before coronation, and no name was ever added. The blank remained, deliberate and accurate. A medieval baker noticed that on days when his dough rose too quickly, arguments broke out in the town. On days when it rose slowly, marriages were proposed. He stopped rushing the process and said the town felt calmer for it. A churchyard tree lost a branch during a storm. Beneath where it fell lay an unmarked grave. Years later, when the grave was uncovered during repairs, it belonged to a traveler who had died nameless. The branch, shaped like a pointing finger, had marked the place all along. Two monks in different countries composed hymns using the same melody without ever hearing each other as work. When pilgrims sang them years later, the tunes aligned perfectly, as if meant to be sung together. In a medieval courtroom, a judge dropped his staff while declaring a verdict. The staff cracked in two. The accused was released. Later evidence proved his innocence. The staff was never repaired. As the night stretches, these moments gather softly around you, not demanding belief, not asking for logic. Just patterns repeating gently like breath. Let them blur now. Let the roads fade into mist. Let bells ring only in memory. The medieval world knew something we often forget. The meaning does not always explain itself, and coincidence does not need permission to exist. Sleep carries these stories the way monks carried manuscripts carefully, quietly, into the dark where they rest, waiting, and do not disturb you anymore. The dark still has room, and the old world is in no hurry. Its coincidences keep breathing, slow and steady, like embers that refuse to go out. In a walled town surrounded by vineyards, a medieval watchman noted something odd in his nightly rounds. Whenever the moon hid behind clouds, he heard footsteps echoing where no one walked. On nights when the moon was bright, the echoes vanished. Years later, after the town wall collapsed, archaeologists discovered a buried passage beneath the exact stretch where the sounds had been heard used briefly, then sealed, its memory lingering only as sound. A medieval painter mixed pigments by hand, grinding stone into dust. One color, a deep blue, always made him uneasy. He avoided it unless commissioned. When modern scientists examined the pigment, they found it contained traces of arsenic that slowly poisoned those who handled it. The painter had lived long simply because his instinct had guided him away. In a convent by the sea, nuns tracked the tides for fishing boats. They noticed that on days when the tide came in silently, without crashing waves, letters arrived bearing bad news. On loud, stormy tides, letters carried relief or joy. They rang different bells depending on the sound of the sea, though they never explained why. A medieval child carved shapes into clay near a riverbank: spirals, lines, small circles. Centuries later, when the river changed course, the exposed bank revealed ancient markings identical to the child's patterns, left by people long before. The shapes had returned as if remembered. In a mountain village, a bell rope frayed year after year but never broke. When a new rope was finally installed, the old one snapped the same day a long-standing feud ended. Villagers said the tension had been held in the fibers all along. A monk copying legal records noticed that whenever he wrote the word for mercy, his hand cramped. He blamed age. But the cramped letters appeared darker, heavier, as if pressed with effort. Those cases later became famous for unusually compassionate rulings. During a plague, a traveling musician played the same melody in every town he visited. People noticed that death slowed wherever he stayed more than one night. When he moved on, it returned. He died quietly on the road, and the melody vanished with him, never written down. A medieval queen kept a cage of birds that sang only at dawn. One morning they sang at midnight instead. The queen canceled a journey planned for the next day. The road she would have taken collapsed in a landslide hours later. In a small market town, A scale used by a butcher tipped unevenly no matter how it was adjusted. Customers complained. Yet when weighed against official measures years later, it proved perfectly accurate. The fault lay not in the scale but in people's expectations. A medieval bridge builder dreamed repeatedly of water flowing backward. He altered the bridge's curve slightly each time the dream returned. When a flood came years later, the altered design diverted debris and saved the town. He never claimed credit. Two manuscripts copied in different regions show the same tear across the same line of text. The tear occurred before the ink fully dried in both cases. No one knows why both scribes paused at that exact place long enough for such damage to happen. In a churchyard, gravestones were laid in uneven rows. When mapped centuries later, the stones aligned perfectly with the rising sun on the day of the town's founding, knowledge lost to everyone who placed them. A medieval physician recorded that patients who spoke of seeing water before death often survived. Those who saw fire did not. He could not explain it, only observed quietly. A castle door creaked at one specific hour every night, even when bolted. When the hinges were replaced, the creaking stopped, and so did the strange dreams shared by the servants who slept nearby. In a remote abbey, two monks independently chose the same day to fast in silence. Neither knew the other had done so. That day, a violent dispute between nearby villages ended unexpectedly, as if exhaustion had settled into the air itself. A child lost in a forest followed the sound of a bell no one else heard. The bell belonged to a chapel abandoned for decades, yet its rope was found gently swaying when the child emerged. As these stories drift on, they lose their edges. They are no longer puzzles, no longer questions. They become something softer, like the sense that the world once paid closer attention to itself. Let your thoughts loosen now. Let the last echoes fade into quiet stone corridors and empty roads under stars that keep their secrets well. The medieval night is deep, and it has carried you far enough. Nothing more is required. Sleep knows the way from here. The quiet does not end. It simply widens like a road that keeps going after the torchlight fades. In a village pressed between hills, a medieval bell was rung only for births and deaths. One winter, the bell rang by itself just before dawn. No one had pulled the rope. Hours later, twins were born on opposite ends of the village, to families who had never spoken. Both children grew to become healers, both known for steady hands and calm voices. When they died many years later, the bell cracked down the middle and was never rung again. A parchment seller noticed that certain customers always arrived just as he finished trimming a sheet, never before, never after. He began to wait, knife in hand, sensing when to cut. Those customers went on to commission important texts, laws, treaties, prayers, documents that shaped their towns quietly but permanently. The seller never learned to read, yet his timing proved flawless. In a medieval port, two ships with different names and flags sank in separate storms years apart. When their wrecks were discovered centuries later, both rested at the same depth, angled the same way, with their bells buried in sand and still intact. Divers said the silence around them felt deliberate, as if the sea had arranged them carefully. A monastery kept a guest book for travelers. One page contained 3 names written in different inks and hands, yet the letters matched perfectly in shape and spacing. All 3 travelers arrived on different days, signed, and left without meeting. Each later became known for walking long distances alone. A medieval baker dreamed of fire and woke to find his oven cold. Confused, he delayed opening his shop. Moments later, the chimney collapsed where he would have been standing. After that day, he trusted his dreams without questioning them. In a convent library, 2 books were stored on opposite shelves. Both were borrowed rarely. Yet dust patterns showed they were taken down on the same days, year after year, as if unseen hands moved in rhythm. The borrow records confirmed it. No one could explain why. A traveling judge noticed that whenever he crossed a certain river at dusk, he felt compelled to show mercy in the next case he heard. When he crossed at dawn, he ruled more strictly. He began timing his journeys carefully, though he never told anyone why. A medieval child traced circles in frost on a window one morning. The same circles appeared hours later in a church window miles away, traced by breath from inside. No one noticed at the time, only the patterns remained in memory. In a stone quarry, workers refused to cut a certain slab, claiming it rang when struck. Years later, that stone was used unknowingly in a bell tower. The bell cast there produced a tone unlike any other, deep, steady, calming. People traveled far just to stand beneath it. A scribe once misstated a letter by exactly 1 year. Historians later realized the letter predicted an event that occurred on the incorrect date, not the intended one. The error had been right all along. During a long drought, a medieval village dug a new well guided by a child who said the ground felt hollow. Water was found exactly where the child pointed. Centuries later, geological surveys confirmed a hidden aquifer there, unknown until that moment. A noblewoman dropped her ring into a river and wept. The same ring was found years later during a drought, lying dry among stones, returned without explanation. She had long since forgiven its loss. In a chapel, candles burned unevenly, no matter how carefully they were made. On days of mourning, they burned quickly. On days of joy, slowly. No change in wax or wick explained it. A medieval map showed a road that no longer existed. Travelers avoided the area, saying it felt wrong. When the road was rediscovered centuries later, it led directly to the ruins of a town lost to fire and forgotten by records. The map had remembered when people had not. 2 bells in different cities were cast from the same melted-down metal scraps of weapons, old tools, broken chains. When rung on feast days, people swore the sound felt familiar, comforting, as if something restless had finally learned to rest. They no longer belong to individuals, places, or even time. They become part of the quiet understanding the medieval world lived with, that not everything announces itself, that some truths arrive sideways, as coincidences, and stay that way. So let the roads dissolve now, let the bells fall silent. Let the ink fade into parchment the way thoughts fade into sleep. Nothing more needs to happen. The night has already connected what it wished to connect. And you are safe to rest inside that gentle, unfinished pattern. The pattern is still open, still breathing, and the night does not mind how long it takes. In a narrow town built around a single well, a medieval woman drew water every morning before sunrise. She said the water tasted different on certain days, lighter, almost sweet. Those were the days travelers arrived safely from long journeys. On days the water tasted heavy, news of accidents followed. After she died, others drew from the well, but no one noticed the difference again. The well was later filled in, its quiet knowledge sealed away. A monk responsible for illuminating manuscripts used gold leaf sparingly. One page, however, seemed to demand more. He added gold until it gleamed softly, even in low light. Years later, that page survived a fire that destroyed the rest of the book. The gold reflected heat just enough to protect the parchment beneath. What looked like excess had been exact. In a medieval marketplace, a stray dog appeared every time an argument was about to turn violent. It would sit between the quarrelers and refuse to move. Fights stopped, embarrassed laughter followed, and the dog would wander away. When the dog died, the market grew tense and disputes often ended in blows. No one ever replaced the dog, as if knowing it could not be done. A bell ringer noticed that when he rang too forcefully, his hands ached for days. When he rang gently, they did not. He adjusted his rhythm, and villagers said the bell sounded kinder, though no one could say what that meant. In a cold monastery, 2 monks shared a room divided by a curtain. Each dreamed of the other falling ill on the same night. Both woke, both checked, both found the other healthy. That day, a sickness passed through the village but never reached the abbey. A medieval shipbuilder marked one beam with a small cross for no reason he could name. That beam later cracked during a storm, bending instead of breaking, saving the ship. The cross remained visible long after repairs were made. In a churchyard, snow melted first around one particular grave every winter. No one remembered who lay there. When records were uncovered centuries later, the grave belonged to a man known for sheltering strangers in winter. A traveling scholar kept losing the same book and finding it again in unexpected places, inns, chapels, roadside shrines. Each time it returned, it contained a new note in the margin, written in his own hand, though he had no memory of writing it. The notes guided his research perfectly. A medieval midwife rang a small handbell during difficult births. On nights when the bell sounded dull, the birth was hard but successful. When it rang clear and sharp, the child was often lost. She never stopped using the bell, saying it was better to know than to wonder. In a castle kitchen, a cook burned bread repeatedly on one day of the week. She changed ovens, recipes, even flour. Nothing helped. That day later became known for a disastrous council meeting held above the kitchen. Smoke rose through the floors, disrupting tempers and delaying decisions just enough to avoid a war. A monk writing a chronicle paused mid-sentence, feeling suddenly tired. He went to sleep and finished the sentence the next day. The pause marked the exact hour a king died far away. The ink before and after the pause shows a subtle difference, like a breath taken. A medieval child followed drifting snowflakes into the woods and found a lost traveler sheltering under a tree. The child said the snow pointed the way. The traveler lived to old age and donated land for a chapel on that spot. Two bells cast decades apart developed the same hairline crack, both cracked during times of political unrest. When repaired, both cracked again during renewed conflict, as if refusing to be silenced completely. A stone step outside a church wore down faster than the others. People tripped on it often. When replaced, the new step cracked within months. Archaeologists later found an older grave beneath it, belonging to a woman who had waited daily on those steps for someone who never returned. In a medieval court, a jester dropped his mask during a performance. The room fell silent. That same hour, a spy was unmasked in a neighboring kingdom. Neither event was known to the other, yet both changed the course of quiet power. A monastery vineyard produced sour wine one year and sweet the next, without change in weather or care. The sour year coincided with internal disputes. The sweet year followed reconciliation. The monks began settling arguments before harvest. A bell in a coastal town rang during heavy fog, though no one had touched it. Ships heard it and avoided hidden rocks. When the fog lifted, the bell rope was found neatly tied, as if by careful hands. And so it goes moment touching moment, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the patience of stone and time. Let these last images loosen now. Let the bells become distant hums. Let the ink fade into the page. Let the roads curve gently out of sight. The medieval world has finished speaking for tonight. Nothing remains unfinished, even if nothing was explained. Sleep closes the circle softly and carries you the rest of the way. The circle does not truly close. It only grows wide enough that its edges blur, and the stories begin to feel like breathing rather than telling. In a hillside town, a medieval woman spun wool every evening by the same window. She noticed that on nights when the thread tangled easily, messengers arrived the next day with bad news. When the thread slid smoothly through her fingers, letters carried joy. She never spoke of it, but neighbors noticed she spun more slowly on certain nights, as if trying not to hurry what was coming. A monastery bell once fell from its tower during a storm and landed upright in the earth without cracking. The monks dug it out and rehung it. From that day on, the bell rang softer, but its sound carried farther. Travelers said it felt closer to their chest than their ears. In a medieval port city, a harbor light was extinguished accidentally one night. Ships slowed, unsure. That hesitation prevented a collision when a hidden current surged unexpectedly. The light was relit at dawn, and no one spoke of the dark as a saving thing, but the logbooks remembered. A scribe sharpening his quill cut his finger and smeared blood across the margin of a page. Embarrassed, he left it. The stain later resembled a branching tree. That manuscript became associated with a powerful family whose symbol was unexpectedly the same tree, adopted generations after the ink dried. Two farmers in different valleys planted their crops late the same year, guided only by instinct. Their neighbors mocked them. Frost came early, destroying the early plantings and sparing the late ones. Both farmers said the ground had felt unfinished. In a medieval inn, a chair was always left empty by the fire. Guests avoided it without knowing why. One winter night, a traveler collapsed just inside the door. He was laid in that chair and survived. The innkeeper later admitted the chair had once belonged to someone who waited there nightly for a loved one who never returned. A convent clock lost 1 minute every day. Attempts to fix it failed. Over a year, the lost time matched exactly the hours spent nursing the sick during an outbreak. When the outbreak ended, the clock kept perfect time again. A bell rope frayed and shortened over decades. When replaced, the new rope was measured against the old and found to be exactly the length needed to reach a hidden cavity in the tower wall. Inside lay old letters, warnings about a structural weakness that would have gone unnoticed. Repairs saved the tower. A medieval child learned to whistle a tune no one recognized. Years later, an elderly pilgrim wept upon hearing it, saying it matched a song from his childhood village, destroyed long ago. No one knew how the child had learned it. In a courtroom, sunlight fell through a high window onto one spot of the floor at noon each day. When defendants stood in that light, verdicts tended toward mercy. When they stood just outside it, judgments were harsher. Eventually, judges began moving unconsciously, guiding people toward the light. A monastery well dried up suddenly. While digging deeper, monks found an old bell buried below. When removed, water returned. The bell was cracked but still rang when struck, its sound muffled by earth, as if it had been calling quietly for years. A medieval healer noticed that patients recovered better when their beds faced east. She changed nothing else. The pattern held, though no one could say why. A merchant dropped a coin into a church donation box by mistake and tried to retrieve it. The box jammed. Frustrated, he left it. That same coin later funded a repair that saved the roof from collapse during a storm that would have killed those inside. In a village square, pigeons gathered in unusual numbers one afternoon and refused to move. Hours later, the ground beneath them collapsed, revealing a forgotten cellar. No one had been standing there. A monk writing music left a rest where a note should have been. Choirs sang the silence instinctively, and listeners said it was the most moving part. A bridge echoed oddly when crossed at dusk. Travelers slowed without realizing why. One evening, the echo masked the sound of stones shifting just enough for everyone to clear the bridge before it partially collapsed. A medieval queen dreamed of snow in summer and postponed a celebration. A sudden hailstorm destroyed the decorated tents that afternoon. 2 bells in distant towns rang at the same moment without coordination. People later realized both towns had just finished burying victims of the same battle, each unaware of the other. These moments are not meant to line up neatly. They overlap, fade, return. They are less like stories and more like weather felt rather than solved. Let them thin now, like mist lifting from a field at dawn. Let the last bell tone stretch and dissolve. Let the ink dry completely. You do not need to follow the roads any farther. The medieval night has carried its coincidences as far as they need to go, and sleep, patient and ancient, gathers them gently and lets them rest along with you. Have you ever felt a whisper of the past, a quiet echo from a time long gone? Today we journey back to the medieval world, not to the grand battles or royal courts, but to the silent corners where small, strange truths unfold. These are the forgotten tales, the quiet coincidences that history rarely records. Our first story begins in a mist-shrouded village on the coast of Francia. A fisherman named Ronan, known for his silence and his weathered hands, cast his nets each dawn. For a year, every single Tuesday, he would find a single perfect scallop shell in his net, always empty, always impossibly clean amidst the muck and seaweed. He never mentioned it to anyone. One day, a traveling merchant passed through, selling exotic goods. He laid out his wares, and among them was a small wooden box. As Ronan passed by, the merchant called out, offering him the box for free, saying it simply felt right. Inside, Ronan found dozens of pearls, one for every scallop shell he had ever found. The merchant was gone by morning, and Ronan never saw another shell. Coincidence? Or a debt quietly repaid by the sea itself? Next, we traveled to a secluded monastery nestled in the highlands of Alba. A young monk, Brother Kieran, was tasked with illuminating manuscripts. His hands were steady, his eyes sharp. For months, he worked on a particular passage about a lone star guiding a lost shepherd. Every night as he worked, he would look out his small window and see a single brilliant star hanging directly in his line of sight, brighter than all the others. He felt a strange connection to it, a silent companionship. The day he finished the manuscript, placing the final touch of gold leaf on the star he had painted, he looked out the window. The sky was clear, but his star was gone. It never reappeared. Was it a celestial guide for his holy work, or just the fleeting life of a distant sun that happened to align with his own? Now picture a bustling marketplace in the heart of Anatolia. A spice vendor named Zara had a peculiar gift. She could tell a person's deepest sorrow just by the way they hesitated before a jar of saffron. She never spoke of it, but she would often add a pinch of sweet cinnamon to their purchase, a silent gesture of comfort. One afternoon, a stern-faced nobleman, a man known for his cruelty, approached her stall. He reached for the saffron, and his hand trembled. Zara felt a wave of such profound loss from him, it nearly buckled her knees. Breaking her own rule, she leaned in and whispered, "The locket was beautiful, my lord." She treasured it. The nobleman froze, his face paling. He dropped a heavy purse of gold on her counter and walked away without a word, his shoulders slumped. No one knew he had lost his daughter a year prior, or that he had given her a small silver locket. How did Zara know? A shared secret, carried on the scent of spice and sorrow. Our final story takes us to a windswept island in the North Sea. A young woman named Ilara was the lighthouse keeper's daughter. She was born deaf and communicated with her own system of hand gestures, understood only by her father. One winter, a terrible storm raged for a week, and a ship was wrecked upon the rocks. The only survivor was a young sailor, washed ashore, delirious with cold. Ilara and her father nursed him back to health. When he finally awoke, he tried to speak, but the ordeal had stolen his voice. Desperate to thank them, he began to move his hands, and to Ilara's astonishment, he was using her exact, unique gestures. A language born of isolation, now shared by two strangers on a lonely rock in the middle of the sea. These are the stories that fall between the cracks of history. Quiet moments and unspoken truths that connect us in mysterious ways. They remind us that even in a world of grand events, the smallest coincidences can hold the deepest meaning. What quiet truths have you encountered in your own life? Thank you for journeying with me into the past. If you enjoyed these whispers from another time, please like and subscribe for more stories. Have you ever had a moment where everything lines up so perfectly it feels like magic? A moment that makes you question if it's all just random chance or if there's some hidden script guiding our lives? Well, the medieval world, a time of swords, castles, and profound faith, was filled with stories like this strange, quiet coincidences that seem to whisper secrets from another realm. These aren't tales of grand battles or epic prophecies, but small, uncanny events that are almost more chilling because of how subtle they are. So, let us pull back the dusty curtain of history and explore some of the most inexplicable coincidences from the Middle Ages. Our first story takes us to a small village in 13th century France. A humble stonemason named Jean was working on the local church, carving a gargoyle high up on the spire. It was a tedious, dangerous job. One day, a fierce gust of wind nearly sent him tumbling. He dropped his favorite chisel, a tool his father had passed down to him. He watched it fall, disappearing into the thick grass below. He searched for hours, but it was gone, lost to the earth. Jean was heartbroken. He finished the church with borrowed tools and life moved on. Fast forward 20 years. The church needed repairs, and Jean's own son, now a stonemason himself, was hired for the job. While clearing away some overgrown ivy at the base of the church, his shovel struck something hard. He dug it out of the dirt, and there it was, his grandfather's long-lost chisel, rusty, but still intact, waiting right where it had fallen 2 decades earlier, found by the one person who would understand its true value. Next, we journey to the windswept coast of England in the 1100s. A young woman named Ilara was set to marry a man she had never met, a common practice back then. Her father, a merchant, had arranged the marriage to a wealthy landowner from a distant town to secure a trade alliance. The day before she was to leave, Ilara walked along the beach, filled with anxiety. She found a unique heart-shaped stone, worn smooth by the sea, and slipped it into her pocket as a small comfort. When she finally met her future husband, a stoic and serious man, conversation was stiff. Trying to break the silence, she nervously took out the stone to show him. His eyes widened in disbelief. He reached into his own pouch and pulled out an identical heart-shaped stone, found on his own shore hundreds of miles away just a week prior. He had been carrying it for good luck, hoping his new bride would be kind. It was a silent, shared sign that perhaps their union wasn't just a business deal after all. Now let's consider the strange case of 2 rival knights in the Holy Roman Empire, Sir Klaus and Sir Ulrich. They were bitter enemies, their families having feuded for generations. They fought in tournaments and skirmishes, each encounter escalating their hatred. One year, both men, unknown to each other, decided to embark on a pilgrimage to Rome. They traveled separately, taking different routes. Yet strange things began to happen. In a remote inn in the Alps, Klaus was given a room, only to be told the previous occupant had left a book behind, a book of poetry that Klaus recognized as Ulrich's favorite. Later, in a crowded market in Florence, Ulrich bought a new dagger, and the blacksmith mentioned he had just sold its twin to another German knight heading south. The coincidences piled up until finally, they arrived at St. Peter's Basilica on the very same day, at the exact same hour. As they knelt in prayer, they saw each other. But instead of anger, there was just a sense of awe, a feeling that a force greater than their feud had drawn them to this moment. They spoke for the first time without malice, and the generations-long rivalry ended, not with a sword, but with a shared, silent understanding. These stories aren't found in the main chronicles of kings and popes. They're whispered in local legends, passed down through families, and pieced together from old letters and diaries. Were they simply chance? The human brain is wired to find patterns, after all. Or were they small miracles, little nudges from fate in an age when people believe deeply in the unseen world? Maybe the line between coincidence and destiny is blurrier than we think. Perhaps these quiet moments are the universe's way of reminding us that even in the grand, chaotic tapestry of history, every single thread has its place. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed diving into the mysteries of the past, be sure to subscribe for more. The night does not hurry, and the medieval world is patient. Its stories drift slowly, quietly, carrying patterns that do not belong to anyone and yet belong to everyone. In a hillside village, a well dug by an unknown hand produced water that seemed to rise and fall in rhythm with the seasons, even during droughts. Villagers noted the pattern but did not understand it. Travelers drank from it and always arrived safely at their destinations, though no one knew why. Years later, maps revealed hidden springs beneath the earth, perfectly aligned with the well's mysterious flow. A medieval bell, cracked and weathered, rang only when important decisions were to be made in the nearby town. Merchants, nobles, and judges alike would feel a strange hesitation or clarity as the toll echoed across the square. After the bell fell silent for decades, decisions were made blindly, sometimes disastrously, until the bell was restored and its subtle power returned. In a castle far from the city, a tapestry woven by an unknown artist depicted a strange pattern of stars and rivers. The noble who hung it noticed that on nights when the stars outside matched those woven into the cloth, events in the castle unfolded with unexpected ease, sudden reconciliations, hidden treasures discovered, disputes resolved. No one could explain why, and eventually the tapestry was forgotten. A scribe copying a manuscript accidentally wrote a line twice. Across the kingdom, in another scriptorium, a monk did the exact same thing on the exact same line years later, unaware of the original text. When historians compared the manuscripts centuries afterward, the duplication seemed deliberate, though no reason could ever be found. In a remote abbey garden, two nuns planted herbs without coordination, yet the plants sprouted in mirror symmetry, leaves unfurling in perfect alignment. The abbess observed silently and only wrote, "The garden itself seems to have knowledge we do not share." A medieval clockmaker created a device that never kept perfect time. Yet somehow it chimed at exact moments that coincided with local births, deaths, and important events. Scholars could not find the mechanism responsible. The chimes simply aligned with life in ways that felt intentional. In a coastal town, a lighthouse light rotated inexactly, sometimes slower, sometimes faster. Ships navigating by its beam avoided hidden reefs, seemingly guided by chance or the lighthouse's subtle rhythm. Centuries later, engineers discovered the currents and tides that had made the timing crucial, but only on nights when the light behaved unpredictably. A medieval shepherd noticed a flock of sheep always moved to the same spot on the hill before storms, though he never guided them. One day, a storm struck early, and the sheep's instinct saved the villagers' crops from being flooded. In a quiet monastery, two monks wrote prayers that ended with the same phrase, exact words, exact punctuation, even the same flourish at the end of the sentence. They had never met, and their monasteries were separated by mountains and rivers. When the manuscripts were compared centuries later, scholars called it miraculous, though no divine hand could be proven. A merchant traveling across kingdoms dropped a coin into a river and never retrieved it. Years later, the same coin was found perfectly preserved in a distant city, helping fund a small act of charity that saved lives. How it traveled no one could say. In a castle kitchen, a loaf of bread rose unevenly. The cook, frustrated, tried again. When she left it alone, it baked perfectly, feeding a family just before a sudden storm cut off the town's supplies. The bread had been guided by unseen timing, unnoticed until much later. A bell in a remote chapel rang at an odd hour during a thick fog. Ships anchored safely in the harbor, though no keeper had touched the rope. The bell rope was later found neatly tied, as if by a careful hand, though no one admitted doing it. Two stone bridges in different valleys developed cracks in the same shape, though built decades apart. When repaired, the cracks realigned with the original flaws, saving the structure from collapse during floods. Engineers centuries later marveled at the coincidence. A medieval healer noticed that wounds healed better when washed with water drawn at dusk rather than dawn. She never explained why, only followed the pattern. Her patients recovered. In a monastery dormitory, one bed was always colder than the rest. Nuns avoided it, though none admitted why. During an illness, the woman assigned that bed survived unscathed, while others fell sick. The bed's mystery remained long after. A traveler followed the sound of singing through the woods, though no one else could hear it. By dawn, he had avoided a hidden marsh that would have swallowed him. He never spoke of the sound. And as the night stretches wider, these coincidences no longer feel like stories. They feel like breathing, like subtle rhythms connecting events, places, and people across time. Let the bells fade into memory. Let the ink dry completely. Let the roads dissolve into mist. The medieval world whispers still, patient, endless, unexplainable. Sleep carries you through it, quiet, steady, and safe. The night lingers, stretching like a slow river through time, carrying with it the quiet rhythm of events that seem impossible to connect, but somehow are. In a village perched on a cliff, a medieval miller noticed his water wheel turned faster on certain mornings without reason. That speed coincided with unexpected bounty, a barrel of grain arriving, a basket of fruit found in the field, a shipment of salt reaching the town just in time. The miller never explained why it happened, and yet the wheel kept spinning, quietly guiding fortune. A scribe copying a history text paused mid-sentence, as though distracted by a sound no one else could hear. That same hour, a battle ended in another kingdom, far away. He later completed the sentence, unaware of what had happened. When historians compared records centuries later, the timing was exact. In a monastery cloister, monks noticed that the pattern of shadows on the stones predicted rain, wind, or frost with uncanny accuracy. They recorded it but could not explain it. Generations later, meteorologists studying historical climate patterns found the notes astonishingly precise. A medieval blacksmith dropped a hammer one day, only to see sparks fly toward a sword being forged. He instinctively moved it aside. Hours later, the forge nearly collapsed, but the blade remained unharmed. No one else witnessed it, and he never spoke of it. A bell tower in a remote town swayed slightly in the wind. The bell rang unexpectedly on quiet nights, and travelers who were lost in nearby forests found their way to safety. Years later, engineers confirmed that the vibrations of the tower subtly echoed through the valley, though only on certain nights. In a convent, two nuns painted murals in separate wings. The designs mirrored each other in strange ways, the patterns repeating without instruction or coordination. The abbess wrote only, "The art chooses its own hands." A child lost a small wooden toy in a river. Decades later, it was discovered perfectly preserved in a mud layer, lying on top of a buried chest of coins from a long-forgotten shipwreck. Its placement had kept the treasure intact. A medieval queen's mirror cracked during a storm. She noticed her reflection was subtly distorted before the crack appeared. Hours later, a letter arrived with news she had feared. Scholars today cannot explain how the mirror knew the message was coming. A traveling physician noticed that patients recovering in rooms facing east healed faster than those facing west. No one knew why. He merely shifted his beds and recorded the results faithfully. In a monastery vineyard, grapes that grew on the northern edge ripened differently than those on the southern. Winemakers centuries later confirmed subtle chemical differences that enhanced the flavor, but no medieval records explain why the monks noticed it. Two bells in separate towns, cast from entirely different metals, rang at precisely the same pitch during the same hour. Witnesses in each town described a feeling of calm, as though the sound reached into their hearts rather than their ears. A medieval baker kneaded bread at the same time every day, unaware that his timing coincided with high tides in a distant river. Those who ate his bread that morning always arrived safely on long journeys, while others faced misfortune. In a castle kitchen, a spoon fell and rolled across the floor. Hours later, a fire broke out that could have been fatal, had the spoon not landed where it did, redirecting a pan and sparing the cook. A scribe copied a genealogical list, skipping a name without realizing. The skipped individual had never existed. Later historians wondered if the mistake had been deliberate, but there is no evidence. A shepherd noticed that his flock always huddled toward a particular rock before storms. One day, a landslide occurred precisely where the sheep would have grazed. The flock survived unscathed. In a monastery dormitory, one candle burned unusually long. On nights when it burned, Prayers were answered in small but meaningful ways. A lost sheep returned. A letter arrived. A dispute ended quietly. A medieval merchant lost a shipment of coins, only to find them years later in an unlikely place, exactly where someone needed them. The coins bore wear that suggested careful travel by unknown hands. Two monks, working in different abbeys, wrote the same prayer in slightly different scripts, yet every line, every flourish, every pause mirrored the other perfectly. Neither had seen the other's work. The medieval world stretches onward in small, quiet patterns, moments that ripple across distances and centuries. Unobserved by most, yet somehow significant. Let the bells fade. Let the ink settle. Let the roads drift into mist. History is whispering softly, and sleep follows patiently, carrying you along its invisible paths. Have you ever felt a shiver down your spine, that strange sense of déjà vu, or noticed a coincidence so perfect it feels like a glitch in the matrix? Well, get ready, because we're diving back in time to the medieval world, a period filled with more than just knights and castles. It was an era of profound mystery, where some of the most baffling coincidences in history quietly unfolded, leaving people to wonder if a hidden hand was guiding events. Our first story takes us to 14th century Italy, to the city of Florence. A man named Gigli was sentenced to death for a crime he swore he didn't commit. On the day of his execution, as he was led to the gallows, a huge crowd gathered. Just as the noose was placed around his neck, a man in the crowd shouted, "Stop! I am the one you seek!" This man, who looked almost identical to Gigli, confessed to the crime. The authorities were stunned. Gigli was freed, and his doppelganger was executed in his place. It was a one-in-a-million rescue, but the story doesn't end there. Years later, Gigli, now a free man, was walking near the very same spot when a loose stone from a building fell and killed him instantly. The universe, it seemed, had a delayed appointment with him. Was it fate, or just a cruel, unbelievable twist of chance? Next, let's travel to the battlefields of the 100 Years' War. In 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, a French knight named Jean de Croix was struck down by an English arrow. His family mourned him, and life moved on. 20 years later, at the Battle of Poitiers, another Jean de Croix, the son of the first, fought bravely for France. In a bizarre echo of the past, he too was killed by an English arrow, but the pattern wasn't finished. Decades later, at the infamous Battle of Agincourt in 1415, a third Jean de Croix, the grandson, met the exact same fate, killed on the battlefield by an English arrow. 3 generations of the same family, all named Jean de Croix, all falling in the same way, in the same long war. It's a tragic family legacy that seems too symmetrical to be random. Now, for a story that feels like it's straight out of a fantasy novel. In the 15th century, King Louis XI of France was a man who deeply believed in astrology. He kept a personal astrologer whom he trusted with all major decisions. One day, the astrologer made a prediction that a lady of the court would die within 8 days. When the prediction came true, the king was terrified. He suspected the astrologer might have poisoned the woman to prove his own powers. Fearing he could be the next target, the king summoned the astrologer to his room high in the castle. He ordered his guards to hide, ready to throw the astrologer from the window on his signal. Before giving the signal, the king decided to test him one last time. He asked, "You claim to know the fate of others. Tell me, what is your own fate, and how long do you have to live?" The astrologer, sensing the trap, looked the king in the eye and calmly replied, "I shall die, your majesty, exactly 3 days before you do." The king froze. His plan was ruined. He couldn't kill the man who held the secret of his own death. From that day on, King Louis XI not only spared the astrologer but took exceptional care of him, ensuring he had the best doctors and protection. The king who had planned a murder was now his potential victim's greatest protector. These medieval tales are more than just historical footnotes. They are whispers from the past, reminding us that the world has always been a place of wonder and mystery. They are quiet coincidences that shout a louder question. Is life just a series of random events? Or is there a hidden pattern, a grand design that we can only catch glimpses of? From a man who escaped death only to meet it later, to a family curse that spanned generations, to an astrologer who saved his life with a single sentence, these stories challenge our understanding of probability and fate. What do you think? Are these just incredible flukes of history, or is there something more to it? Let me know your theories in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into the unexplained, be sure to subscribe for more historical mysteries.